The wars that built America's global influence. Where are you watching? From which city and which country? Drop it in the comments. And please subscribe, like, and share this story so it can reach more people and help us question and rewrite the history we were told. Now listen carefully, because this story begins quietly but grows into something powerful and dangerous, a story that many think they know, but few truly understand. A story that begins with a war that changed the direction of a nation and the fate of the world. And it all starts with the Spanish-American War, a moment in time when ambition crossed the ocean and refused to return. Soriaconte stood at the edge of the shore as the early morning light touched the water. The waves moved slowly but carried a strange tension, like the ocean itself knew something was coming. And beside him stood Aben Mensah, an elder whose voice carried the weight of many years. He did not speak at first. He simply watched the horizon, where ships appeared like shadows, ships that did not belong to this land, ships that came from far away with purpose and power. Sori asked what they wanted, but Abena did not answer immediately. Instead, he told Sori that long before this moment, the United States had been a nation that mostly looked inward, building its strength quietly, growing its industries, expanding its economy, and by the time the late 1800s arrived, it had become one of the strongest producers of goods in the world, even surpassing great powers like Britain. And with that strength came a desire for something more, something beyond its borders, something that could not be satisfied by staying at home, and that desire slowly turned into action. Abena explained that when conflict broke out between Spain and its colonies, especially in Cuba, the United States saw an opportunity, not just to help, but to step into a new role, a role that would change everything. And when the war began, it was swift and decisive. Spain was already weakened, and the United States used its growing power to defeat it quickly, taking control of key territories across the Caribbean and the Pacific. Places like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines became part of its reach, and Cuba, though not officially owned, fell under its strong influence. Sorai listened closely as the wind grew stronger. He began to understand that this was not just a war, it was a turning point. A moment when a nation decided it would no longer stay within its own borders, but would instead reach outward and shape the world. Abena told him about the Treaty of Paris that followed, how it ended the war but opened a new chapter, a chapter where the United States became an imperial power. And Sori felt a deep unease because he realized that when a nation gains power over distant lands, it begins to see those lands not as equal partners, but as extensions of itself. And that kind of thinking changes everything. It changes how decisions are made, how resources are used, and how people are treated. Abena then lowered his voice and said that many believed this was a noble act, that it was about freedom and liberation. But beneath that surface was a deeper truth, a truth about control, about securing trade routes, about establishing naval bases that would allow influence to stretch across oceans. And Sori noticed how the ships in the distance seemed to grow larger as they came closer, as if they carried not just goods and soldiers, but the weight of a new world order. Abena continued, and said that before this war, Spain had been one of the dominant empires, controlling vast territories. But this conflict marked the end of its power in many regions. It was a clear signal to the world that the old empires were fading and new ones were rising, and among them, the United States stood strong and ready. Sori asked if this would bring peace, but Abena shook his head slowly and said that power rarely brings peace. It often brings more conflict, because once a nation begins to expand, it must defend what it gains, and in doing so, it becomes involved in more disputes, more wars, more struggles for control. And Sori felt a chill as he realized that this single war had set off a chain of events that would not stop, events that would lead to even greater conflicts in the years to come. Abena then pointed to the horizon and said that what Sori was seeing was not just ships, it was the beginning of a new era. An era where distance no longer protected nations, where power could reach across oceans and shape lives far away. And as the sun rose higher, the light revealed more ships, more signs of movement, more evidence that the world was changing faster than anyone could fully understand. Sori stood in silence as he tried to take it all in. The stories, the warnings, the reality of what was happening. And in that moment, he realized that history was not just something that happened in books. It was something alive, something that moved and grew and affected everyone, even those far from the centers of power. And as Abena turned to leave, he spoke one final time. His voice calm but filled with meaning. He said that this war was the spark, the moment when the United States stepped onto the global stage, and that from this point forward, the world would never be the same. And as Sori watched the ships continue their journey, he felt that he was witnessing something much bigger than himself, something that would shape the future in ways no one could predict. And deep inside, he knew that this was only the beginning. The days grew heavier with tension as Kwame Bediako sat under the dim light of a flickering lantern, his hands holding a worn newspaper that carried stories from faraway lands, stories of alliances, betrayals, and a growing storm that no one could stop. And as he read, the name of a great conflict appeared again and again, the World War I, a war that had already consumed Europe before the United States decided to step in. And Kwame could feel that something deeper was unfolding beneath the words on the page, something that went beyond battles and soldiers, something that was reshaping the balance of power in ways the world had never seen before. He leaned closer to the lantern as he read about how the war had started with tensions between powerful nations, how alliances pulled country after country into the conflict until it became a storm that covered entire continents. And for a long time, the United States stayed away, choosing neutrality, watching carefully, building its strength while others fought and weakened themselves. But as the war dragged on, as resources ran low and casualties grew into millions, the moment came when the United States made its move, and that decision changed everything. Kwame read how their entry in the year 1917 brought fresh energy to the Allied forces, how their industries produced weapons and supplies at a scale no one could match, how their soldiers arrived with determination, and how that sudden shift tipped the balance against the Central Powers. And as he read this, Kwame realized that this was not just participation, this was influence. This was power being projected across oceans once again, but this time on a much larger scale. He stood up and began to walk slowly, his mind racing with questions, because he could see a pattern forming, a pattern that began with the earlier war against Spain and was now growing into something much bigger, a pattern where the United States stepped in at critical moments and reshaped outcomes. And as he stepped outside, the cool night air did little to calm his thoughts, because he knew that this involvement marked a major shift, the end of isolation and the beginning of active global engagement. And he wondered what that would mean for the rest of the world and for people like him who lived far from the centers of decision-making but were still affected by them. And as he walked through the quiet streets, he remembered the words of an old traveler who once said that wars were no longer just about territory, they were about influence. And now he understood what that meant. Because the United States was not just fighting, it was shaping the future, shaping the rules, shaping the order that would follow the war. And when the war finally came to an end, Kwame read about a leader named Woodrow Wilson, a man who spoke of peace, but also carried the vision of a new global system, a system where nations would come together to prevent future wars, a system that would later become known as the League of Nations. And Kwame could not help but feel both hope and suspicion. Because while the idea of peace sounded noble, he could also see how influence was being extended in new ways, not just through military strength, but through ideas, diplomacy, and economic power. And as he continued to read, he learned how the United States emerged from the war stronger than ever, its economy booming, while others struggled to rebuild, its financial power spreading across nations that now depended on its support. And this gave it a new kind of control, a control that did not rely on armies alone, but on money and policy. And Kwame felt a deep unease as he realized that this kind of power was harder to see, but just as strong, and sometimes even more dangerous, because it could shape decisions without a single shot being fired. And as the days passed, he noticed how people around him spoke of the war as something distant, something that had ended, but he knew better. He knew that the effects were still unfolding, that the decisions made during and after the war were setting the stage for future conflicts. And one evening, as he sat with an elder named Fanta Sissoko, he shared his thoughts, and she listened carefully before speaking in a calm but serious tone. She said that every war leaves behind seeds, and those seeds grow into the next conflict if they are not handled wisely. And Kwame felt the weight of her words because he could already see signs of unrest, signs that the peace was fragile. And as he looked back at the newspaper in his hands, he realized that this war had done more than end lives. It had changed the position of the United States forever, turning it into a central player in global affairs, a nation whose decisions could shape the fate of others. And as the lantern flickered again, casting shadows on the walls, Kwame felt a sense of anticipation mixed with fear, because he knew that this was not the end of the story. It was only another step in a journey that was becoming more intense, more unpredictable, and more dangerous. And as he closed his eyes for a moment, he could almost hear the echoes of the future, echoes of another war, bigger and more devastating, waiting just beyond the horizon, ready to test the limits of power once again. The sky burned with a strange glow as Adwo Sarpong pressed herself against a broken wall, her breath quick and shallow, her heart pounding as distant explosions shook the ground beneath her feet. This was no ordinary conflict. This was the World War II, a war that swallowed entire nations and left nothing untouched. And as she looked around at the ruins of what was once a lively street, she realized that the warnings of the past had come true. The seeds planted after the last war had grown into something far more destructive, something that no one could fully control. And as she moved carefully through the shadows, she remembered the stories she had heard from elders like Kwame and Sori, stories of how power had been rising, how the United States had stepped into global affairs and never stepped back. And now it stood at the center of a conflict that stretched across the world, from Europe to Asia, from the oceans to the skies. And when the United States entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, everything changed. Its factories came alive with relentless energy, producing weapons, vehicles, and supplies in numbers that seemed impossible. Its soldiers were sent across continents. Its navy dominated the seas, and its influence grew stronger with every passing day. And Adwa could feel that this was not just a fight for survival, it was a moment that would define the future of the entire world. She ran past a group of frightened civilians who huddled together in silence, their faces filled with fear and uncertainty, and she wondered how many lives would be lost before this war came to an end. The scale of destruction was beyond anything seen before. Tens of millions perished. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. And yet within this chaos, something else was taking shape, something powerful and lasting. And when the war finally ended, the world stood at a crossroads, and at that crossroads stood the United States, stronger than any nation had ever been. Its economy was the largest in the world, its military unmatched, and its influence stretched across continents. And Adwoa later learned how this power was used to shape a new global order, one that aimed to prevent another disaster like this, one that sought to bring stability through cooperation and shared responsibility. And this led to the creation of the United Nations, an institution designed to promote peace and dialogue among nations. But even as this organization was formed, there were tensions beneath the surface, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, two powerful forces with different visions for the future. And these tensions quickly grew into what became known as the Cold War, a period not defined by direct confrontation between the two superpowers, but by indirect conflicts, political pressure, and a constant struggle for influence across the globe. And Adwoa listened carefully as travelers and traders shared news of these developments, news of how the United States was not only rebuilding its allies, but also strengthening its position through economic systems like the Bretton Woods institutions, including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which helped stabilize economies but also extended American influence into the financial systems of many nations. And she began to understand that power was no longer just about military strength. It was also about control over money, trade, and policies. And as the years passed, she heard about alliances forming, particularly one called NATO, a military alliance that brought together nations to counter the influence of the Soviet Union. And this alliance showed that the United States was not only leading but also organizing the world in a way that aligned with its interests. And yet, this new order was not peaceful. It was filled with smaller conflicts that carried the weight of the larger struggle. And Adwoa heard of the Korean War, where forces backed by the United States fought to stop the spread of communism in Asia, and later the Vietnam War, a long and difficult conflict that tested the limits of American power and revealed the challenges of maintaining control in distant lands. And as she listened to these stories, she began to see a pattern of intervention, of influence, of constant effort to shape the direction of the world. And she could not help but wonder if this cycle would ever end. One evening, as she sat by a small fire, an old man named Mamadou Keita spoke in a quiet but firm voice. He said that every great power believes it can control the future, but the future has a way of resisting, of pushing back, and he warned that the more a nation tries to extend its reach, the more challenges it creates for itself. And Adwoa felt the truth in his words. Because she had seen the cost of this power, she had seen the destruction, the loss, the fear, and she knew that while the United States had emerged as the dominant force, it also carried the burden of maintaining that position, a burden that would lead to more conflicts, more decisions, more moments that could either bring stability or chaos. And as the night grew darker, she looked up at the sky, now quiet but still holding the memory of war. And she realized that the world had entered a new era, an era where one nation held immense power, but also faced immense responsibility. And she wondered what choices would be made in the years to come, whether they would lead to peace or to another storm. And as she closed her eyes, she could almost sense that the story was far from over, that another chapter was already forming, one that would test the limits of power in ways no one had yet imagined. And deep within her, there was a quiet but growing understanding that history was not just a series of events. It was a living force, shaped by decisions, driven by ambition, and always moving forward, no matter the cost. The morning air felt heavy as Lamin Touré sat alone in a quiet room, his eyes fixed on a small radio that crackled with urgent voices, voices filled with fear, anger, and confusion. And then the words came through clearly. A shocking attack had taken place, an event that would shake the entire world and mark the beginning of a new kind of conflict, the war on terror. And as Laman listened, he could sense that this was not just another war like those before. This was something different, something that did not follow the old rules, something that would reach into places that once felt safe. And as the details unfolded, he heard about how the United States responded with speed and force, launching military operations in Afghanistan to target those responsible, and later extending its actions into Iraq. And Lamin felt a deep tension rise within him, because he remembered the stories passed down from Sori, Kwame, and Adwoa, stories of how each major conflict had expanded the reach of American power, how each war had pushed it further into global dominance. And now this moment seemed to continue that pattern, but in a more complex and unpredictable way, because this was not a war between clear nations alone. It was a fight against non-state actors, groups that operated in shadows, groups that did not have fixed borders or traditional armies, and that made the conflict harder to define and even harder to end. And as Laman stepped outside into the busy street, he noticed how people gathered around televisions and radios, their faces tense as they tried to understand what was happening. Some spoke of justice, others spoke of fear, and many simply watched in silence, unsure of what the future would bring. And Lamin could feel that the world had entered a new phase, a phase where security became a constant concern, where surveillance increased, where decisions were made quickly in the name of protection. And he wondered how far this would go, how much power would be used, and what the long-term consequences would be. And as the days turned into months, and months into years, he followed the developments closely. He heard about the invasion of Afghanistan, where the United States and its allies aimed to dismantle terrorist networks and remove those who supported them. And at first, the operation seemed swift and successful. But soon it became clear that this was not a simple mission. Resistance continued. Conflict stretched on, and the war became one of the longest in modern history. And Lamin began to see a familiar pattern. A pattern of initial strength followed by prolonged struggle, a pattern that echoed the lessons of earlier conflicts. And then came the invasion of Iraq, justified by claims that later became highly debated and controversial. And this decision sparked intense discussions around the world, discussions about power, responsibility, and the limits of influence. And Lamin listened as voices from different sides argued their positions. Some believed the actions were necessary to maintain global security, while others questioned whether such interventions created more instability than they resolved. And as he absorbed these perspectives, he realized that the role of the United States as a global force was no longer just accepted without question. It was being examined, challenged, and debated in ways that reflected a changing world. And as he walked through the market one evening, he overheard a conversation between two elders, one named Fatoumata Jallow and the other named Issa Doumbia. And they spoke quietly but with intensity. Fatoumata said that the United States had become like a guardian, stepping in wherever it saw danger, while Issa responded that even a guardian must know its limits, because too much control can lead to resistance. And Lamin paused to listen, realizing that this simple exchange captured the complexity of the situation, the balance between protection and overreach, between leadership and dominance. And as the night grew darker, he returned home and sat in silence, reflecting on everything he had seen and heard. And he began to connect the dots between past and present. He saw how the Spanish-American War had marked the beginning of expansion beyond borders, how the World War I had signaled a shift into global involvement, how the World War II had established unmatched dominance, and how the Cold War had turned that dominance into a long struggle for influence across the world. And now this new chapter, the War on Terror, was testing the limits of that power in ways never seen before, and Lahman felt a deep sense of both understanding and uncertainty. Because while the pattern was clear, the outcome was not. And as he continued to follow the news over the years, he saw how the conflict evolved, how new technologies were used, how intelligence and surveillance became central tools, how alliances shifted, and how the definition of victory itself became unclear. And he noticed how the idea of a global policeman emerged, a role often associated with the United States, a role that involved responding to threats, maintaining order, and influencing global decisions. But he also saw how this role came with heavy criticism. How many questioned whether any single nation should hold such responsibility, and whether it could do so without creating new tensions. And as Lahman spoke with younger people in his community, he noticed a growing awareness, a willingness to question, to seek deeper understanding. And this gave him a small sense of hope, because he believed that awareness could lead to better choices in the future. And one day, as he sat with an old historian named Boubacar Traoré, he asked a simple question. He asked if this cycle of power and conflict would ever end, and Boubacar looked at him for a long moment before answering. He said that history is not a straight line. It is a path filled with turns, and while power can shape the world, it can never fully control it, because people, ideas, and circumstances always change. And Lahman held on to those words as he walked home that evening, the sky above him calm and quiet, a sharp contrast to the storms he had been studying. And he realized that the story of power was still being written, that each generation had a role to play, that the decisions made today would influence the chapters yet to come. And as he reached his door, he paused and looked back at the road behind him, a road filled with stories of war, ambition, and transformation. And he understood that while the past could not be changed, it could be learned from, and perhaps that was the key to shaping a better future. And as he stepped inside, he whispered to himself that the story was not over, that it was still unfolding, and that somewhere in the world, new decisions were already being made. Decisions that would determine whether the next chapter would bring peace or conflict. As the night settled in, the silence carried a question that remained unanswered. What will come next, and who will shape it? This is American Global Force, the place where hidden history is revealed. Where are you watching from? Which city and country? Tell us in the comments. And if you have not subscribed, please do. Like and share this video so more people can see it, because the truth only grows when it is shared.